Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My talk is titled Psychedelics in the Media. And over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to hopefully convince you that the most powerful tool we have in advancing the psychedelic movement beyond science and funding is actually storytelling, and specifically in the way that psychedelics are being framed within the mass media. So, just to give a quick layout of my talk, I will start by formally introducing myself and then define psychedelics in mass media. I'll introduce my theoretical framing and provide an example, and then introduce my research question, followed by a really quick literature review. I then have a methodology, which I'll present through a video, followed by a quick analysis with conclusions and a call to action. So, hello. To formally introduce myself, my name is Joelle DelPrete, and I just graduated from Temple University with a master's degree in media studies and production. As a lover of all things unconventional, as well as documentary series, when the time came to decide what to do my master's project on, I settled on a documentary series about psychedelic portrayal in the media. Um, Now, I actually heard about psychedelic therapy in a really interesting, unique, you've probably never heard of way, which was through Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. Of course, I'm joking because Michael Pollan's book was a New York Times bestseller when it came out in 2018 and was followed by a really successful Netflix adaptation in 2022. Michael Pollan was actually so successful at bringing psychedelic therapy to the forefront that some researchers and newspaper article writers have called this renowned interest in psychedelics the Pollan effect. So, one of the things that Michael Pollan talks about in his book that really stuck with me was this one specific study where cancer patients were given a one-time treatment with psilocybin to deal with their symptoms of anxiety and depression relating to their cancer diagnosis. The results of this study were really fantastic. It had an 80% success rate in most of the subjects, and the anecdotal evidence that Michael Pollan gave when he interviewed these individuals just really stuck with me and proved the efficacy of psychedelic therapy to me personally because I really could not think of anything worse than getting a diagnosis like these people had and feeling relief after just one session with a psychoactive drug. So, what is psychedelic assisted therapy? So, psychedelic assisted therapy is a type of therapy approach that uses psychoactive substances in a structured setting. I realize that there is a lot of ways that people might use psychedelics to heal themselves, but for this talk specifically, I'm really focusing on like the westernized, medicalized version of psychedelic assisted therapy that involves some integration, going in and sitting with like a professional while you undergo the treatment, and then some like integration session afterwards. So, what is mass media? Just to differentiate from any type of media you might see, mass media is an organized group that uses standardized methods to disseminate messaging. And mass media structures have audiences and then habitually try to get those audience to come back, keep coming back to the content that they push out. So, all of these logos you may recognize are examples of mass media. So, the theoretical framework for my documentary series and that I used in my accompanying research paper that I also did with my documentary series is framing theory. And what framing theory posits is that, just like a picture frame, how something is presented to an audience actually can influence how the audience processes that information. And so when you're thinking about news framing and news framing articles, you're thinking about metaphors, imagery, and the salience of words that keep coming up over and over again. So I thought a really good example of this was the crack cocaine scare that happened in the 80s and early 90s. So crack cocaine use was on the rise in the 80s in America, and it really became a front page issue in the mid 80s into early 90s. So looking back on it, researchers have realized that part of the hysteria surrounding the crack cocaine crisis was media attention to it. At this time, crack cocaine was the front cover of all the biggest magazines. It was receiving daily headlines and big news publications like the New York Times. And it was also the subject of a lot of the cable news documentary series like 48 Hours on Crack Street from CBS. And a lot of misinformation spread during this time. There was this myth that there was thousands of crack kids and cocaine babies being born, and it was sort of presented as a problem that was affecting all of America everywhere, when really the most abuse with crack cocaine was happening in inner city, poor areas, and mostly to people of color. And so All of this media hysteria and the moral panic that ensued around it resulted in some pretty devastating consequences. One of the worst pieces of legislation to pass in America's war on drugs was the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. And what that did is create new mandatory minimum sentences for drugs and increase the amount of spending the government could use to jail people for drug use. And this disproportionately impacted Black Americans, and it still does so today. So, I just think it proves how much a media hype can contribute to some real consequences. And just to show that this isn't just about drugs, I wanted to give a more timely example. So, a more recent study found that Fox News viewers who habitually view Fox News held immigration policy and preferences that more closely aligned with the way that Fox News covers immigration. And if you didn't know, Fox News routinely covers immigration quite negatively. So I did all of that explanation to hopefully prove to you that framing is about giving context to whatever the content is that you are reading and seeing in the news specifically. So my question for my documentary series and that I address in its accompanying paper is how was the psychedelic renaissance being framed in our mass media today? And how might that impact or impede the public's understanding of psychedelic therapy as a legitimate treatment for psychiatric disorders? So when I was doing the literature review for this, I really couldn't find much. Did, however, find one really helpful master's thesis by a woman named Gina Giorgio, who I actually ended up interviewing in my own documentary series. So what Gina did in her master's thesis was through the years 2017 to 2023, she took the five most popular US newspapers and coded them. And what she found is that psychedelics were most frequently highlighted in a positive light. She also found that sacred use, which is relating to indigenous use, using psychedelics as a way to expand consciousness and as a religious sacrament, was the least cited theme mentioned. And so, looking at these numbers and seeing that psychedelics were more frequently highlighted positively in media, I came across this term called the hype bubble. And what the hype bubble refers to is basically how there's overly positive coverage of psychedelic therapy and that it's potentially causing some negative effects. So, what researchers are finding is that this hype bubble is potentially causing expectancy bias in clinical trials, and it's reinforcing a lack of reporting on adverse effects. Some also believe that this could impact hasty policy decisions regarding psychedelics and psychedelic therapy. However, I really wanted to see if this term held up in real life beyond academics and beyond newspaper articles, because as we know, sometimes that's not always the case. So, to do that, I zoomed in and talked to six professionals across the psychedelic industry. And I did this through my documentary series in what I like to call a semi-ethnographic methodology. And what I mean by semi-ethnographic is that I really took the time to get to know these people before I interviewed them. In 5 out of 6 of the cases, I went to their home and visited with them and sat where they are in their space and tried to basically increase our bond so that I could get more honest and open answers. Throughout the process, I was very honest, sending them my cuts and making sure that they were okay with the way they were being represented in my documentary, and really reflecting on my own positionality, which I also have a write up in my research paper about. I think the best way to show you what some of these professionals had to say about psychedelic portrayal in the media is to play you a clip of my show, and I hope you enjoy.
I mean, it's almost as if like the media got like a press release doing like psychedelics are in now, like just talk about how great they are.
It disempowers people from understanding that ultimately it's your inner healer that's doing that work.
I think sometimes there's a tendency for people to try to sell psychedelics in the media. Something that bothers me about that is there's not a conversation about why our mental health care system exists as it is.
Each piece, the medicine, the community, and your practitioner are all going to be tools that are going to support you as you go through this process. And it's a process of coming out of separation and suffering.
So the alt media or independent media space has phenomenal coverage that a lot of folks don't even really know about.
We've seen so many stories about psychedelics healing properties and how it's transformed people's lives. But I think that if we're not getting that information out there on a larger scale, then how relevant is it?
It's the most amazing thing to watch someone come to life. It's like they were sleeping their whole life and now suddenly they're awake.
Okay, so thank you for watching that. I know it's a captive audience, but thank you anyway. I could talk about all six of those people forever and ever, but I will just focus on two who are a little more closely related to the field of mass media. So the first person you saw speak was Patrick Murphy, and he's a filmmaker who created the documentary Psychedelia, The History and Science of Mystical Experience. In that documentary, he actually interviewed those cancer patients that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation and was also really impacted by their personal stories and their journey of healing throughout their psilocybin treatment. However, when Patrick was going around screening the film and giving talks to promote it, he opened up to me about the sort of uncomfortable vibe he was getting from what he called uninhibited enthusiasm from people who were excited about psychedelic therapy but didn't seem to know much else about it beyond that it worked. He also really gave me a lot to consider when thinking about ethical considerations within the psychedelic renaissance and how psychedelic therapy is actually going to play out in our westernized medicalized system and just different viewpoints that I really hadn't seen before in the news. Another person I want to highlight is Jack Gorstein. Jack is an independent journalist who actually got his start in the November 2024 election in Massachusetts. In that election, there was a ballot initiative to legalize a form of psychedelic therapy. This ballot initiative was ultimately defeated. And during his coverage of it, while covering the ballot initiative, Jack realized that there was a lot of misinformation in the media at the time. There was a lot of misalignment between the grassroots organization in the state of Massachusetts who supported psychedelics. And there was really no move from the political action committees and the financial backers of the ballot initiative to correct any of this misleading information that was popping all up in the news. And so, because of that, Jack has really dedicated himself to creating a coalition of writers and media and content creators to bring more nuanced and in-depth coverage of psychedelic policy. This is because he really believes that a big reason that ballot initiative didn't pass is because the information about it was not communicated to the public in the best way. And there was a lot of division within the messaging and just basically a big mess that was showcased through the news and within media at the time. So, what are my takeaways from this project on that I've been working on for basically the past year of my life? I really think that studying framing is important because it allows us to see dominant narratives and how that might impact to public opinion. So, just like Gina saw that sacred use was missing in those top five US newspapers, you can kind of see whose voices are the loudest and who's sort of being silenced. I also realized that psychedelics, along with other drugs, historically have been sensationalized in the news media. And I think this is because, in a way, psychedelics are sensational, so it's quite easy to do. On top of that, modern mass media has a tendency to politicize and sensationalize basically anything because it has to seek views in an oversaturated online media market. And so, what can we do to bring better coverage to the psychedelic movement? My actionable items, first and foremost, I really believe that we need to study how media framing affects public support. I also think we should uplift minority, critical, and independent voices within psychedelic media because this is going to bring nuance and depth that a lot of people that I talk to think that the psychedelic movement is missing. Lastly, I think we should unify our messaging across communities to prevent further legislative failures like what happened in Massachusetts in November 2024. I also want to bring this up really quick. I think the time is now to investigate the link between psychedelics and mass media. This form you see on the right side of the screen is a Google form that the very popular, if not the most popular, psychedelics podcast called Psychedelics Today created to keep in touch with their listeners after being formally banned from all of Meta's accounts. I also include this picture of Donald Trump's inauguration because I want to show how influential our media institutions are, that they're basically front row at our most recent president's inauguration. They have a lot of power, and so it really is important, I think, now more than ever to investigate the ways that psychedelic messaging is getting out because it's going to impact public opinion and that is going to impact policy decision. So, the goal of this talk was to hopefully convince you that while there are many things that are going to bring psychedelic assisted therapy to the masses without legal repercussion, I think one of the biggest reasons that's going to happen is the way that we frame it in our mass media channels from the psychedelic industry side. I think as the next generation of thought leaders in the psychedelic space, it is our duty to speak up when we see really good journalism about psychedelics and speak out when we see misleading or misinformed journalism about psychedelics. Um, I want to leave you all with this quote from American philosopher and linguist, which is that truth must be framed effectively to be seen at all. Thank you so much for this platform, PsychedelX. Shout out to my mentor, and my name is Joelle DelPrete. Thanks so much for listening.